Right, for the avoidance of all possible doubt this time, we are going to 47 Freeman Way, Maidstone, Kent, on page 49 of the report. Item 15. Is everyone on the same page? Right? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Well, you've probably heard some of this before, but I'll... so the application for a change of use of a dwelling house to a house in...
Speak up a bit, please.
Yeah. Change of use of a dwelling house to a house in multiple occupation of 8 bedrooms. Within the description, there's a reference to a loft conversion, including a dormer window and a Velux roof light and a parking. That's a plan of the property edged in red with the parking area hatched to the front of the property in a residential area. What I'll do, I'll just take you through the photos of the property and the plans and then go through the issues from there. There was an urgent updates and they were to clarify Councillor Powell's comments and to call the application in and a clarification on the vehicular crossover from the property to the highway. That's the rear of the residential property, and again, that's the front of the property behind the ambulance. And that's the dormer window for the loft conversion from another angle. And that's it of today's date, finished with the parking area to the front complete. This was the property before the works carried out, and that's the loft conversion. And that's the internal layout, which shows 8 bedrooms with bathrooms and shared facilities on the ground floor. So basically, the application was called in by Councillor Powell, and there's been other concerns regarding the application, and including the loft conversion, parking, drainage, the crossover, footpath crossing, and noise disturbance. I think it's an important point to make in the first instance that the loft conversion, although it's included in the description, is understood to be undertaken whilst the property is still a dwelling house, and it was undertaken by under permitted development rights of the property, and that's made clear in the application supporting statement. And it's also a key point when considering the impacts of this development that planning permission isn't required for a material change of use from a dwelling house to a house in multiple occupation up to 6 people. And that is the fallback position that the officer has used in the report in terms of assessing the impact of, is there a material impact or above what could be undertaken without planning permission of 6 people and the additional 2 rooms within the property. In terms of the parking, obviously it's a clear position that the property could be occupied by 6 people without any parking provision, and in any case there is 4 spaces to the front of the property, and the surrounding road network hasn't got any restrictions. In terms of drainage, there isn't considered to be any evidence that the network is under stress or this would make a material impact on the drainage capacity. And obviously the visual impact of the development was undertaken. It isn't really a material consideration because it was undertaken with under permitted development, so those visual impacts were not within the control of the council. Similarly, the parking area, subject to it being undertaken in permeable materials, and the crossover on an unclassified road doesn't also need permission. So essentially we're assessing the additional impact of 2 rooms or 2 persons, and it's not considered there's any harm that's caused by that in the officer's view. It's also a pertinent point that the Maidstone Borough Council have issued a licence now till which will run till 2021 for a HMO of 8 persons. And therefore, the officer recommendation is to approve the application subject to conditions, which includes location of bin store and limiting the occupation of the property to 8 persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I see Mr. Duffy for the objectors, please? If you'd like to come forward, you have 3 minutes.
Good evening. Because of the way this belated planning application has been processed, and to deter any future developments being completed without proper planning considerations, I would recommend that the application for alterations to 47 Freeman Way be refused. Work on this development started some 4 months before planning consent was applied for. As soon as the neighbours became aware of the work commencing, they were told that a 4-bedroom family house was being converted into 8 flats. This raised some serious and pertinent concerns. This area is a relatively quiet and established community of individual dwellings. Because there is not enough off-road parking on the existing properties, the roads in the vicinity are already occupied by on-road parked vehicles, so much so that refuse lorries and other large vehicles have difficulty negotiating the roads opposite this house. The developer wants to impose an accommodation of up to 10 persons with a potential of 10 more vehicles and with only 4 spaces available on the property concerned. There are a number of elderly residents in the surrounding streets, and any emergency vehicles would be seriously hindered. There are also serious issues with sewerage. Due to a fault in the sewers in Garden Close get blocked approximately twice a year. Numbers 1, 3 and 5 Garden Close suffer an overflow of sewage, causing considerable problems for these properties. As the proposed development will be capable of discharging double the amount previously coming from 47 Freeman Way, this will make matters much worse. There is a loss of privacy because of the dormer window in the loft extension. The windows on the rear of the dormer overlooks the gardens of 1, 3 and 5 Garden Close. The window on the front overlooks the kitchen window and the garden of 11 Spencer Way. The developer claims that the tenants of the proposed developments will be vetted and the property will be regularly inspected and maintained to a high standard. This would be very unusual for a house of bedsits. I believe that had Maidstone Council been correctly informed about this development, these issues could have been dealt with and may have had a bearing on the planning decision. The work on this development should not have started without planning consent. That's all I've got to say, other than there was a petition with 50 signatures from the local residents.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duffy. Mr. Ryan for the applicant, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In the time that's been allocated for me to speak, I would like to address several points that are relevant to this planning application. By way of introduction, I'm a member of the National Landlord Association and a member of Platinum Property Partners, an organisation who is committed to providing high-quality, intermediate accommodation in sustainable locations. I'm aware that some concerns have been raised by local residents regarding my application for change of use to an 8-bed house of multiple occupation. Firstly, I would like to underline that this development complies fully with local and national policies and is also helping to meet a housing need in the area. On more than one occasion, I have heard the rooms in my property referred to as flats. For the avoidance of doubt, the rooms in this house are not flats. This is a shared house for professional people. The house is finished to the highest standards and is currently tenanted by 5 young professionals. The tenants include 2 police officers, a biologist and a software programmer. In each case, the tenants have moved from outside of Maidstone to take up employment in the local area. These are hard-working, professional people who are not likely to cause problems or disrupt the feel of the neighbourhood. Since February, I've been in close contact with Mr Philip Jennings, a Housing and Health Officer at Maidstone Council, and Mr Jennings has issued an HMO licence for 8 people at the property, subject to my achieving the necessary planning consents for change of use. Throughout my ownership of this property, I've made myself available for discussion with neighbours, and that remains the case. I'm a responsible landlord, and I will be accountable for my property and its tenants. One of the concerns that has been raised has been with respect to potential parking issues. This property offers 4 off-street parking spaces, which I believe will fully meet the need of the tenants at the property. I also consider this parking provision to be consistent with local policy, for example, the Kent and Medway Structure Plan 2006, Supplementary Planning Guidance 4, Vehicle Parking Standards Guidance, which states that for a 4+ bedroom dwelling, 3 car parking spaces should be provided. To the concern raised around drainage, this should not be problematic since the main sewers will be adequate to deal with waste, and it is highly unlikely that all the showers, toilets, washing machine, etc. at the property will ever be running at the same time. On that basis, the usage should be no greater than that of a large family. I do not envisage refuse being an issue because the increase of 2 tenants in the property is not likely to materially impact the amount of waste that is produced at the property. With respect to the potential for loss of privacy and the objections that have been raised regarding the appearance of the dormer extension, this extension has complied with the Residential Extension Supplementary Planning Document 2009 and is proportionate in scale to the roof plan of the house.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there, Mr.
Okay,
Ryan.
I was nearly done. Thanks. Thanks for considering my application.
Right. Any declarations of lobbying? Councillor Powell's been lobbied, of course. Anyone else? No. Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to you, Councillor Powell, as I believe this is in your ward.
Yes, it's the first one I've had in my ward, which is quite good. Anyway, can I just say that I'm extremely disappointed with this application and the whole process. My call-in, which hasn't been registered on this evening's note, well, it has been registered, but it didn't register it in full, because it did state at the end that there was questions that I could ask, which I could go on, and let me explain the reasons why. Firstly, can I mention that this development is not in Maidstone's draft local plan, albeit it is referred in the planning statement. This application started as a permitted development, which can be lawfully carried out given the visual impact does not particularly change. On the 21st of June, a planning application was signed by Mr Ryan, the applicant, stating that work hadn't started on the application, which it had. I can only assume that this was on the permitted development part, which is constantly referred to, as opposed to full planning permission, which is being sought this evening. Can I also mention that the property is now finished, and here we are this evening looking to give permission to this 8-bedroom property, of which 2 are double rooms actually, so it actually totals 10 people, and not 8 people that is constantly referred to. I would like to know which part of the building has been done under permitted development and which is being applied for as the full planning application this evening. It also states on item 705 that only 6 rooms will be rented. So why are we here tonight? What about the 2 double rooms and the extra car park space? On section 801, it's contradictory, given it states that the impact of 2 additional persons, or 4 as they're double rooms, is considered marginal and not sufficient to justify refusing planning permission. It is therefore considered, it should be granted, which is wrong. And also, it gets better, because I look on section 9, which talks about the recommendation, which when it's granted, that we should also give conditions. Well, if I can just read out just some of those conditions. The development hereby permitted shall be begun before the expiration of 3 years from the date of this permission. The place is already finished. There are 5 people that have moved in. It's got the vehicle hard standing hereby approved shall be surfaced in a water permeable material. Sorry, Mr. Officer, can you hear me? I think he's talking. Okay. Again, the place has already been done with the water permeable material. The details of the size, design and siting of any refuse bin housing shall be submitted for prior approval in writing by the local planning authority and shall be available for use on occupation of the 4th bedroom. Well, here we are tonight, the planning committee. Oh, it's gone off. Oh, it's blown up, yeah. No more than 8 persons shall be resident at the premises at any one time. Well, we've got 6 single bedrooms and 2 double bedrooms. That's 10 people. So I will summarise. It started as a permitted development with no permission. Permitted development doesn't need permission. You seek planning permission once the property was nearly complete. The council are stating it's only a couple of additional rooms, so what's the problem? It's a bit like a car being stopped for doing 80 miles per hour on the motorway. Oh, it was only just over the limit. I would suggest that although I don't agree with the sustainability of various other parts of this application, given there is nothing from highways, actually, there was something from highways, but I'm not going to repeat that to tonight's meeting because that would be quite embarrassing. Or South East Water, yeah, that we can comment on. If this had been started and finished as permitted development, there will be little I could do to object. However, I'm going to put in a recommendation that this application be refused on the basis of a misuse of permitted development law. For reference, this franchise partnership and others have used this same tactic to develop property all around Maidstone and the country. I think Fantwell, they'll probably see a number of these, yeah. We can, of course, as a council, introduce an Article 4 directive to stop this happening again. But for further reference, there is a second bill reading going through Parliament next Friday with cross-party support called the Protection of Family Homes, Enforcement and Permitted Development. This should help the local councils with future powers. Oh, crikey, that's not the government, is it? Was it something I said? Yeah. Right. Let me take you back to my recommendation. This application for full planning be refused on the basis of misuse of permitted development law. Thank you.
I think there are some things the officers certainly need to clarify, but I would say that unless someone can tell me differently, I don't believe that is a legal thing to do. Because that is not in any way something that this committee could actually do. There may be reasons to refuse the application, but saying that you don't agree with the way that permitted developments have been used is not a ground that we could legally use, unless the legal officer tells me differently. And I will ask him, in case I'm wrong.
Thank you. No, there's not a reason, a misuse of permitted development. It's because he's got permitted development for 6 units. He's applying for planning permission for 2. It's not a misuse of permitted development rights. He's exercised his permitted development rights. And those permitted development rights will have standard conditions attached to them. Unless we are saying that there's been a breach of those conditions, which are attached, which I don't think we are. So we've got to have a planning ground. That's misuse permitted development is not.
Okay, can I just disagree with that, please, in its entirety? And I'm not taking anything away from your sort of kind of legal position or legal advice. But there's right ways of doing things and there's wrong ways. This is wrong. I've actually pointed out the reasons why it's wrong. I believe it's legally wrong. And I also believe that the council should actually kind of own up to that, to say, yes, we have made a mistake. No, it's not going to happen again. I think there's a little bit of naivety over this whole subject of what is permitted development and what is what they call it sui generis, that there is a difference between the two. And I think, with all due respect, I think you're getting the two mixed up.
Right. Councillor Powell, permitted development rights are set out in the General Development Order and amendments to that, and are very clear as to what they are and aren't. Sui generis is a planning use category that means it doesn't fall within one of the generally, like residential or retail A1 or whatever. It's falls outside that definition, hence sui generis, which is the Latin phrase for outside of the boundaries or outside of a genre. I agree. High Street, you may be unsurprised to learn, is somewhat overrun with houses in multiple occupation. I and my fellow ward councillors are sick to the back teeth with HMOs, and some of them have very good landlords. I know nothing about Mr. Ryan as a landlord. He may well be a very good landlord. Some of the ones in High Street are very good landlords. Some of them are absolutely terrible, and they do go up to the wire and then beyond it. The difficulty is, I don't like the current legal position, and if this Act of Parliament goes through, that legal position may change. But regardless of whether we like it or not, it is the legal position. And I don't personally feel the officer has made a mistake in interpreting that. Just because we don't like the outcome, it doesn't mean it's been wrongly handled. But I'm quite happy to entertain any planning ground that you'd like to put forward in terms of the actual harm these two units have done. But before we go any further, we do need to clarify exactly how many people are going to be resident in this property, because clearly some doubt has been thrown on that, and we do need to, before we do anything else, establish that.
Thank you. My understanding then is that it's for 8 people, 8 bedrooms, and if you look at the recommendation, there's a condition saying no more than 8 people shall occupy the property, so it wouldn't be for 10, it would be for 8.
And the obvious supplementary to that is, how confident are we that said condition is impossible? Because that's what it comes down to. To be honest, I think it's going to be hard to argue that 2 extra people is going to overtop it. But if it's 4 or more, it does start to become a real issue. So how enforceable is this condition?
Yeah, I've seen it on other permissions about limitations of occupiers, and obviously if there was a concern from someone that more people were occupying it, then obviously enforcement could investigate. And the other sort of dual legislative control is the licence. The licence is only up to 8 persons, so if they were breaching that, obviously they could potentially have the licence withdrawn from them.
Okay, Councillor Powell, as it is your ward, I will let you come back briefly.
Sorry, it actually states on the report that there will be a maximum of 6 people. The licence, which has already been given, actually states 8. But then we have the 6 single rooms plus the 2 double rooms, which gives 10. No, sorry, I thought I said too much. Yeah. So I think you can see one of it's full of inconsistencies. And okay, there's the permitted development, not a problem. 6 people in that property, I haven't got an issue with. I have got an issue with 10, because 10 has an impact on parking spaces under the guidelines that have been laid out. I mean, 10 for 4 car parking spaces, and I would just say, you can get 4 cars on this drive, but how they open the doors, I'll never know. You know, so there's lots of inconsistencies, but what I would like to know, or even put a directive or a condition, that the condition be that only a certain amount of people actually live in this property.
If I might come back, Chair, my understanding of the application is for a house in multiple occupation with 8 rooms. The suggested condition, condition 4, as has been already pointed out, limits that to 8 persons, not 10 persons. You know, I think that's perfectly clear. As paragraph 7.05 points out, as things stand, up to 6 rooms can be rented out as the property is now, without consent. So, you know, I think as has been commented on so far, it is those additional 2 persons that is the focus of the discussion this evening.
Yeah, we'll come back to that later. Councillor Cox, I think you indicated some while ago and you've been very patient.
As always, thank you. Can someone clear up which part was done under permitted development? And my question, therefore, is it, and a nod will do, the dormer that was on this, was that put on as permitted development, or was it that they could have 6 people with the HMO as 6, as the permitted development?
It's my understanding that the dormer and the physical works to the external were done under permitted development when it was a dwelling house, so it had rights for roof extensions, additions and that sort of thing. And that's the same with the parking area and that sort of thing.
Okay. Why on earth? So anybody can build a dormer on any house under permitted development at the moment and destroy the view that is a normal street scene. Well, it's one of the first things we're told when we come onto this committee. You can object to things if it changes the street scene and it doesn't look like the other houses. But this looks like a carbuncle's been shoved on the side of a roof. Look at it. It's just unbelievable. And that's permitted development. Well, I'm afraid development means going forward and improving in my ears, and I'm afraid that doesn't. And if can park 4 cars on this, as Councillor Powell stated, you can't open the doors, so perhaps you get out through the boot or something. But I don't see how we can say you can have... There are going to be 8 people in there, but if you go back to the floor plans, I didn't see any cookers. I didn't see anything other than a shower and a toilet. So really what we've got is a temporary space to live in. So are we looking at something about the actual amenity provided by this house for the people to live within it? Because I don't think it's a very good standard. They may have set this by the national standard, but there is nothing we can look at and say, we don't really want this. We say, yes, fine. If we have got a building that's of adequate size to sustain 8 or possibly 10 people, because they might have the odd girlfriend round, I suspect, or partner. Therefore, you could have 10 people in here very easily. But I wouldn't mind knowing how, or can you just correct me, we can put anything on a building and it's permitted development.
I'll just clarify those 2 points. You can do certain things under permitted development that perhaps, you know, out in planning, if it's a planning application, might not be acceptable. But they're the limits government set to development that householders can carry out without planning permission. Equally, you could put a 2-storey extension on. There's various rights that are given to house owners to be able to develop their home without the relevant planning process. So, yes, something like this would be permitted development because it's within the criteria set in the legislation. And in terms of the sort of the quality of the internal and amenity for the occupiers, it obviously is part of the process for the licence is that it meets various standards and they have to be upheld. So the fact they've got issued a licence would suggest it meets all the criteria in terms of the quality of the building to be occupied for those number of people. So.
Are all those windows in the dormer all obscured? They're all obscured glass, or do they not open?
Yes, they're obscured and non-openable, and there's a condition on the planning permission to secure that going forward.
Councillor Clark, I would like to move this forward. If at all.
I've got some questions about this. If the windows aren't openable and it's a three-storey, if the windows aren't openable and it's a three-storey property, do we not have a situation where, in a fire, we might have an issue? I'll carry on actually, rather than do them one at a time. The other thing is, in terms of a planning group, we're looking at we look at the design, and we typically, with a development like this, if it was coming towards us fresh, we would look at the fact that this might be oppressive to neighbouring properties, whether it's incongruous with the street scene in a residential neighbourhood. And I want to question whether we cannot, just because, I know it's got a licence, but the licence is is subject to planning permission. So they have almost deferred that back to us to make sure we're happy with it as a planning committee. I'll leave that to you to come back on. And the other part is to do with not just the fire aspect, but the fact that this has to provide some sort of amenity for current and future residents. And I do wonder what sort of residential amenity are we giving to somebody who's two of them are going to be living in rooms that are completely obscure glass. I'm very concerned about the application.
I'll let the officer come back later. I'm going to take another member before we do, otherwise we're going to be a while. Councillor Bolton.
Thanks very much. Councillor Clark's last point was actually one I was going to raise myself, so I'd be grateful to hear the answer as well. Perhaps the officer could also address the issue on the harm arising for neighbours as well on this particular thing, particularly in terms of noise and disturbance, and whether this is compatible with the nature of Freeman Way.
Now we're going to take a couple more points before that. Councillor Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. I think this is one of the most hideous things I've ever seen. I would hate to live next door to it, and I bitterly regret that I very, very much doubt that there is anything that we can do, because it has been built, if I can call it built, within government regulations. This is what permitted development is. It allows people to build what they like within a certain parameter of the house. And if officers can think of any conceivable reason that we could refuse this, I would warmly welcome it. However, we have to bear in mind that all we are asked to do is to consider the impact of 2 additional people living in this house. And I think we're on a sticky wicket. Like it or not, I reckon we've got to lump it.
And the only thing I can think of is whether those double rooms should be redesignated, because it does seem to me to be a potential loophole. Given it's almost tempting fate. If you'd like to come back on that and the other.
Okay. As firstly on the double bedroom point, as proposed, I don't see any specific double bedrooms designated. The conditions suggested limits occupation to 8 persons, which equates to 1 person per bedroom. I think that's sufficient to control it in that respect. I would also make the point that due to the need to administer and control the HMO, the Health and Housing Officer has applied the appropriate controls, which cover appropriate amenity space standards. One will also notice that each of the bedrooms has its own shower and toilet accommodation, and there is a kitchen and living room which presumably is accessible by all tenants. Certainly the relevant housing officer considers that the amenity is adequate. And I think, as Councillor Gooch has pointed out, these physical works are permitted development, and there's nothing straightforward we can do about that.
Thank you. I feared that would be the case. Councillor Prendergast.
Just two quick questions. Just looking at policy and other considerations, could the officer just tell me what H22 is? And I'm just looking at DM8 here, which is also quoted, and regarding redevelopment of a house into multiple occupation, it says here, the intensified use of the building and its curtilage would not significantly harm the appearance of the building or the character and amenity of the surrounding area. I think we're all agreed that that doesn't meet the criteria set out in DM8. I understand about permitted development, but this seems to have been surely permit. I was always under the impression that even with permitted development, it came to, you know, a planning application is submitted and we have some say over design or materials or, well, I've come across various permitted development applications in rural areas where we've had some say in materials, in design. So why isn't that the case here? Because
my understanding is that the works which are being carried out are permitted development. There are times when householders and others will approach the council and ask formally whether the works they proposed are permitted development, and an application will be made to that effect. That's not a requirement, that's something householders can ask for. My understanding is that that did not occur in this case and is not required in this case. I would also point out a small correction to the officer's point. The windows in the dormer are not entirely obscured. Paragraph 7.06 points out that the windows on the flank dormer are obscured, but the windows shown to the front and the rear of the dormer are referred to, and those have no need to be obscured and indeed are not obscured as I understand it. So you're not in a bedroom with no outside view whatsoever. And I think that the other point to make is reference was made to policy H22 from the 2000 adopted plan. My understanding is that's not a safe policy and therefore no longer applies. Okay. I will just have a check on that.
While the officer's checking that, I will take Councillor Powell, and that will be it.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm still very confused, and I think the officers may be confused as well, because permitted development is up to, as you just rightly said, and I think Councillor Cox mentioned it earlier, up to 6 people. After 6 people, it becomes, was it sui generis or anything that isn't elsewhere classified into a house of multiple occupancy. I'd like to know which part of the house, as I mentioned in my little speech earlier on, is permitted development and which of it isn't.
Right. Well, first of all, the extension, the dormer and the other bits were done as a dwelling house, so that's clearly permitted development. In terms of the HMO, I don't think it's subdivided, but if you'd like to.
Yeah.
So simply the use for 6 persons, so that the use is 6 persons, so it's not like the external works where it's physical, it's the use which is the issue. So that's hence the extra 2 persons on the application, the difference.
Okay, so that's 2 of the rooms will be empty. Does that what that means?
Yeah, if there was 2 empty rooms, then it wouldn't need consent.
I think it's fair to say those rooms could be used by the other tenants, but not by additional residents. So you could use them as lounges or studies or something else like that.
And this is not a very satisfactory situation. I don't think any of us like this application. Either the permitted development that was there as a dwelling house, which I think is unpleasant. Unfortunately, permitted development rights have always been moderately extensive, and they have been extended a lot by the last government and the current government. So we're a bit stuck with that. So in terms of the actual HMO issue, I am struggling for a reason to do anything other than very reluctantly grant it, because we have to demonstrate that the actual excess to people is going to, in itself, do more damage, or at least some damage, compared to 6 people. And I'm actually struggling, in planning terms, to find a reason to do that, having checked out the conditions, because obviously if we're going up to 10, that could have been a different argument. So I really am struggling. But if you have a reason, Councillor Powell, that's related to the particular planning impact of those extra 2 people on site, now's your chance.
Well, I'm hoping that someone else can actually come up with, as my bit was turned down. But, yeah, there is an impact, and I perhaps gave a stupid example earlier on about the 80 miles per hour on the motorway. It's either right or it's wrong. I mean, I think the officers have actually indicated, well, yeah, 2 more is not going to make a lot of difference. But to be quite honest, the law is the law. And the 2 more that's not going to make a great deal of difference or a great deal of impact, or 1 extra car or 1 extra shower at the same time as somebody else in the morning, there has got to be a reason, even if, well, simply because the council have actually recognised that it's wrong. So please help me out.
Councillor Powell, I'd love to, but I've been involved in planning for longer than I care to remember, and I honestly can't think of anything. Councillor Bolton, and then and Councillor Stockwell after that, then I really will move to a conclusion. Councillor Bolton.
Well, I've not been in planning as long as you, Chair, but I'll try anyway. Going back to the point I made earlier about the additional 2 residents causing an increase in noise and disturbance in the vicinity, is that something that we may be able to handle on? Perhaps the additional trips that are generated along the road, perhaps, although I know highways haven't been particularly helpful, the detrimental impact that will have on residential amenity. I am kind of, I don't want to say clutching at straws, but I'm trying to find something here. So they're just suggestions more than anything.
I'm struggling. Will Councillor Stockwell, while I think about it.
Mine's very similar. I mean, it is a small cul-de-sac. We're looking at some, 8 or 9 bedrooms here. They'll all have cars if they're all, single occupancy. They're all going to be turning in the cul-de-sac headland there. So I think there is an issue on the residential amenity of the people who already live there. I think and also the noise. Somebody mentioned sewage earlier on, or the amenities, and I think that should be checked. Why can't we just limit it to, say, 6? They can always come back later and increase it if there isn't the sort of amenity loss that we think there's going to be. I mean, I would suggest that we grant permission for up to 6 bedrooms, I suppose, whatever you call them, and that I don't know whether we can limit cars. It says in the thing it's ideal because it's near on a bus route. Well, it's not going to make any difference on a bus route. They're going to walk anyway. They're going to walk to the bus. They're going to drive. People are going to go into Maidstone. I think that's a red herring. It may be in a sustainable location, but Downswood is not very near the centre of town.
It's not in Downswood. If it's in anywhere, it's near Seneca. It's not actually in Seneca, but it's very near it. Right. My aunt used to live at 2 Garden Close, so I am fairly familiar with the location. Members, I do sympathise, and I sympathise with the public, but I can't honestly think that that is anything other than an appeal that's lost without any conditions and costs, because that is not going to float. So I am now going to propose the recommendation on the papers with the urgent update. Sorry? No conditions on the papers, and that's what I'm concerned about. The risk is that we turn it down without good grounds and there are no conditions, because inspectors are not very keen on imposing conditions. So we've been down that path before when we've offered false hope to residents by flimsy grounds for turning things down, and we've ended up with a worse situation than we got now. So that's why I'm moving it with the urgent updates on the papers. Is that seconded? Councillor Harwood, do you wish to speak now?
No, but you've set out the planning law situation that there is no alternative. The planning was changed and is more laissez-faire. And it's deliberately to bring forward affordable housing, and that's why they did it.
I will reluctantly put that to the vote. Those in favour of the recommendation on the papers, please indicate. 5. Councillor Hastie indicated as well. Then she put it down again.
Hands up, please. Sorry. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Those against? Right, you now don't have to give reasons for whatever you're going to do, which that aren't. Yeah, no, I wasn't. Take that again.
So, who's 4?
For approval.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Those against?
1, 2. Against. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that?
Yes, that is a
Yeah, that's 5. As I said, that's lost. I would now like... Sorry? Abstentions, yes. 2. Right. I'd now like to hear what else is going to be proposed. There are no grounds whatsoever to refuse this application. None. Officers, what do we do now? Can we invoke the referral procedure? Can we defer? Right, members, I'm moving that we defer this application for further consideration because we have no grounds for refusal, and if we refuse this now, we are in really serious trouble.
I'm still waiting for a response on H22.
Yes, would you do that while we're waiting? No. Site visits will mean that only those people who attend the site visit will be able to vote on the application. If you do not go, you will be unable to vote on the application. That is our procedure. Generally speaking, the result of those has been that we have not had enough people go on the site visit to actually make a decision. So I would strongly recommend against that. It's been a disaster when it's been tried. Now, I would like to propose that this application is deferred for one cycle for further consideration because at the very least we need to give more thought to the grounds because we don't have them at the moment. Secondly, Councillor.
For additional information.
Yes, for additional information and further consideration of. Councillor Ball.
Could we maybe articulate then as a committee some of the further information that we would like to come? So, for example, Councillor Powell talked at the very start about highways and any comments that they've got which are absent. Sorry. And drainage and sewerage as well, and anything else. And parking.
I think given the issues, given that we do need to, yes, to say what it is we need to seek, and the highways and a drainage report are appropriate in that situation. So if we are going to go somewhere with this, we do need some additional consideration. To check the parking layout is actually usable, because that point has been raised about the turning distance and the actual ability to get in and out the vehicle.
Yes, it is. Can I just mention, I did say there was one thing that I wasn't going to mention earlier on today, but this was and I think this is on the public website, so it's nothing that nobody else can actually see. But there was an email that went from a person in NBC to the highways person on KCC, was to say, can you take this email as a formal consultation with Kent Highways, and I await your views. The response from KCC, I'm sorry, whoever the person was, but can we stick to the process that are in place to put planning applications on our database and be distributed accordingly for a formal response? That's disgusting.
Point taken, Councillor Powell, but I'm not going to debate this further tonight because deferral has been moved, so unless anyone else wishes to put anything further in the request for information, that's it. We're not going to discuss it if we're deferring. Yes.
I'm on. Can we also have a bit more detail about the this HMO licence and where it fits in, and this, which was where the planning application fits into this as well? Yeah, and also about the site boundary and so on and so forth.
Site boundary, yes, but the HMO licence is not a matter for planning consideration.
But a bit more information on where it fits in, where the application fits in relation to that would be helpful.
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
What I mean is that it seems to be in the background of every single discussion we have about the fact this HMO licence was given for eight people beforehand, and I just think that it would be helpful for the committee to have more information on that.
If I may, I think it was said that the granting of the HMO licence was subject to getting planning permission. So it is not the fact that it has been granted; it is conditional grant. But we can check the terms of the HMO. The second element, of course, is that for the deferral, it's if there's a need for additional information or if there are disputed facts within the report. So, but we need to know what those are that you're asking us to look at.
I think it's fairly clear that members want more information on highways, drainage, and Councillor Powell is disputing not the number of cars that can be got on the frontage, but the actual manoeuvrability of those vehicles on that. Is that correct? Yes, well, that's manoeuvrability, effectively. I think those are the considerations. Councillor Clark, if you wanted to add anything to that list.
My suggestion, given that we're purely looking at the move from essentially 6 people to 8, the aspect of the current and future residential amenity for those occupants.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. And of course, what I did forget was that Councillor Bolton wanted to actually see, in broad terms, what the HMO licence actually says. There's no reason you can't see it as background, although it's not precisely a consideration. But it might be useful for members to see that. Now, that's everything, and I'm now moving to the vote on deferral for those reasons. That's everyone. So obviously no votes against or abstentions. Right, thank you. I'll just give members of the public who might have been here for that a moment or two to leave if they wish to. Oh, right. My apologies for that slight break there. We now move on to item 16, page 55, London Road.
Thank you, Chair. This is an application for demolition of the existing residential property and a new apartment building, which is 8 flats laid over 4 floors. As some of you may see, that it's a resubmission of a earlier application that was refused in February, I believe. It's on London Road, adjacent to some existing flats. I'll take you as the site area with the residential property here, the Millennium Green here, which is an area of open space, and then you've got Sweetbriars Court with a block of flats to the south. This aerial picture perhaps shows the context of the site a bit better, where you'll see the application site here, the flats adjacent to the site, some other flats over the road. And obviously this application has sought to address the reasons for the previous refusal. I'll just take you through some photographs and then go through the plans and the relevant issues. There's Bry Court looking southwards from the application site. There's the boundary of the site with the footpath to Millennium Green. There's the rear of Bry Court, southeast. The northwest face of Bry Court. Northeast from the rear of Bry Court. Sweetbriar Court, sorry. Yeah, he's got that. That's taken from the car park of Sweetbriar Court towards the application site, and there's Christmas Lodge in the background beyond the hedge. That's the London Road, looking across the road, blocks of flats, and there's back towards the application site. You can just see the property beyond the vegetation. And this is the context of the site, the other flats opposite the site. And that's the street scene. And that's a further restaurant. So you can get a feel of the architectural styles and forms along London Road. It's taken a lot of photos. And there's the Millennium Green looking across, where you've got the quite a substantial hedge scrub line, which is in the process of growing up. So this is the previous refusal, which was a more modern approach to the site. It's set back. As you'll see in the officer report, there was a drafting error on the previous application in terms of the plotting of the adjacent flats, which is actually a bit closer to the application site. But obviously that's been addressed in the report. These are the floor plans, which again over 4 floors, 8 flats. And there's the design, which I think is around about 12 metres. It was refused on grounds of its design, massing, scale. And I think the important point was it failed to address the local distinctiveness of the area, which, as I said earlier, you can see in the photographs is a bit more traditional, maybe traditional architectural form with gables and traditional features. So obviously this application has sought to address that reason, that's our reason for refusal. And I think this plan is very useful at showing the previous scheme overlaid on the proposed scheme with the dotted outline of Christmas Lodge in red. So you can see it's been set back from the boundary by probably half a metre. The actual projection forward of Sweetbriar Court is less, and the hipped side element has been set further away from Sweetbriar Court to give a bit more separation. I'll just go back. The separation distance is about 7.5 metres, I believe, from flank to flank, 10 metres from there and 5 metres across here. But this is obviously unlike the previous scheme. It's using a pitched roof, so the actual apex is set further into the site the ridge line here is set further in. So unlike the previous scheme, the bulk is taken away from the boundary. And obviously there's the Millennium Green here, parking laid out to the front with landscaping. This is taken from the design and access statement, which seeks to show the street scene, and you can see it's somewhat subservient to the adjacent Sweetbriar Court. This is this is actually an older picture. It's actually hipped now, as you'll see on the plan. And beyond that, this element runs back through the site, and there you can see a visual of the proposal from the street, and floor plans which show 2 flats on each floor, access from a central lift and lobby area. You'll see that the windows facing Sweetbriar Court are obscured glazed or serving secondary rooms such as bathrooms, kitchen, diner, and they've got an open aspect to the other sort of Millennium Green elevation. That's a similar plan to before, just showing the outline of the previous scheme and how the hipped roof element, and then obviously it's a narrower element running back into the site. And there's the elevations. Obviously that's the front elevation, rear, and that's the side facing Sweetbriar Court, with the other elevation facing onto Millennium Green. Yeah, it's sought to address the reasons for refusal with a more traditional architectural style, using traditional materials, and that's why it's approved subject, or recommendation is approved subject to conditions to the relevant matters, which are laid out in the report. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, first speaker this evening on this, and sorry you've had a very long wait, Mr. Hawkins, but if you'd like to come forward now, I'm sure you know what to do.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. As the case officer said, this is a full application for the erection of 8 flats following the demolition of the existing house, Christmas Lodge. I'm sure members will agree, I think Christmas Lodge, and we accept as an attractive dwelling at present, but rather dwarfed by the existing flatted development next door. As has been stated, it's a site that has been previously before members for consideration. I was actually at that committee, although not representing the applicant. And to be honest, I tended to agree with members' overturn of the recommendation. I thought the previous scheme didn't respond positively to the character of the area. So subsequent to that, we've been invited to work with the applicant. And whilst residential amenity wasn't cited as a ground for refusal last time around, on reflection we felt that not only reducing the eaves height of the building, but also to pull it slightly away from the boundary, would actually have some beneficial effects, both in terms of the mass and bulk of the building, but also with regard to residential amenity. So we held pre-app discussions with officers and also met with members on site to try and ascertain what the concerns were and the way forward. We feel that this more traditional form of development, i.e. with a pitch roof, brick elevations and more articulation in terms of breaking up of the mass, particularly with the Millennium Green elevation, is a response that we feel fits more positively with the character and appearance of the locality. Likewise, as I say, whilst it wasn't a previous ground for refusal, we feel that this has benefits in terms of residential amenity, i.e. the eaves heights are lower and there's a greater distance between this proposal and the building next door. Obviously, last time around there was no grounds for refusal in terms of highways, ecology, drainage, etc., and we've kept that very similar to ensure that obviously no additional concerns are raised. So, to conclude, we fully accept this is a sensitive site on a main thoroughfare into and out of the town centre. The redesigns that we've brought about, and we have tried to address some of the, I think, sensible concerns that Councillor Pickett previously raised, although not all of them. We feel that this has brought forward a development which is in keeping with the area and responds positively to the development on adjacent sites. We therefore hope that members are able to support the application and grant consent accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hawkins. And his name's been mentioned and now he gets called. Councillor Pickett, please.
Good evening, Chairman, members. Members, as we are aware, the first application for this site was rejected for being poor design, and we obviously accept that. 4.2.2 in the PPF paragraph 7 states an environmental role contributing to and protecting and enhancing our natural build and historical environment. Replacing the old house at this location, I'm not sure achieves this. Having said that, the new design goes much further than the previous offer and has incorporated many amendments and suggestions. There are a few points and observations I'd like to make. The application declares a build of 3 stories. However, if you view the elevation plan, it appears to show 4 stories. I'm still concerned with in relation to the new proposed build in distance terms to the flats next door, known as Sweetbriar Court. Although, again, this has been amended and the proposed build comes within a very few metres of these residential flats, thus emitting light and giving a very small buffer zone. I'm further concerned with the egress and access at this location due to the busy main London road and a rise in the elevation of the road at this point. In my view, there has not been due attention made to the landscaping on this application, especially with its location next to the Millennium Green Park, and again for the air quality factor at this location. If on this occasion, however, you are minded to approve this application, then I would again, although not a material consideration, wish some planning control. 1, the density of the build and the narrow gap between the neighbouring flats be considered. The use of some useful materials from the old house to be recycled into the proposed build, and the naming of the proposed new build. This will help and go some way to maintaining the history and distinctive character of this gateway site. Thank you, Chairman and members.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pickett. Admirably concise. Draw members' attention to the need to make any declarations of lobbying. Anyone been lobbied? I've been lobbied by Councillor Pickett and by Councillor Harvey. Right. Now, Councillor Harwood, I believe you indicated.
Thank you, Chairman. This is clearly a huge improvement over the last scheme, and actually we've managed to change a few applications. The Hillread application opposite on the former off-licence site next to the off-licence was improved, and I think we've done the same here. There was a lot of discussion on the earlier application around the treatment of the landscape area on the site frontage. And I recall there was a desire by members to have at least a couple of lime trees planted into the areas to reflect the avenue of limes down the London Road in that area, because there's a clear gap in the site frontage. It is talking here about a landscaping scheme being submitted, and I suggest that we should incorporate a reference where it talks about the 2 landscaped areas on the site frontage, that they incorporate small leaf lime, because that's what lines the road, and they have a positive impact on air quality, and they're of a scale to be a foil to such a large building. Apart from that, I'm happy to move that we grant permission as per the papers. Thank you.
Clerk, you're seconding that, presumably with the amendment.
Yes, I am.
Do you wish to speak now?
Really, given the original proposal, I guess the applicant could have taken our views on board, or they could have went to the appeal route. And really, when we look at it, this is such a better scheme than the original. I'm quite pleased that we're not having to fight an appeal for that and potentially ending up with something significantly worse in terms of design. So I think this is a good response.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. I have to say that this is a a considerable improvement. I was going to describe the previous scheme as looking like the Lubyanka, but actually the Lubyanka is quite an attractive building by comparison. Perhaps East Berlin or Romania under Ceausescu would have been a comparative benchmark for the previous design. I'm glad the point Councillor Harwood makes about the frontage landscaping is one I strongly agree with. Can I just check that the points that Councillor Pickett raised about the landscaping between the site and Sweetbriar Court, and particularly facing out towards the Millennium Green, have been fully addressed in officers' views?
Yes, the condition 12 specifically mentions those boundaries to be addressed through a landscaping scheme. I think on the last application, actually the Allington Green Society actually commented on about how it would be good to allow that boundary to grow up, which I saw on the site visit today, that it is actually maturing nicely on that boundary, and it's actually quite difficult to see the flats beyond. So condition 12 would achieve that, subject to detail, and obviously including the lime trees to the frontage.
Yes, I do hope that's what happens, because we have had some landscaping conditions recently, very important ones, which actually haven't quite happened, so we will be watching. In terms of the, shall we say, technically non-planning issues that Councillor Pickett raised about trying to reuse some of the traditional material and the naming of properties, these are not planning issues, but could possibly be addressed by an informative. Would either of the movers have any particular issue with that? Councillor Harwood.
No, there is a suggestion that tiles will be used on the outbuilding to the rear of the property anyway. It mentions in the report, so no, there's no problem with an informative. And continuity of that name, if it could be accommodated, would only be positive. So, yeah, happy with an informative in that direction.
Thank you very much. Councillor Clark, any problem? No.
I'm happy
That's
to take
okay.
it to the vote.
Fine. We're going to add those two. Councillor Cox, and then we...
I think you've almost answered the question. I was going to say, how do we incorporate something from a house into quite a modern design? And if we're just going to be using the... I can see that. I was envisaging you using the eaves, the boards or the soffits or something like that. But anyway, that's fine, thank you. And I think they'd like to have it as a Boxing Day court, I think, because it's after Christmas.
Suggestions will be welcomed, of course. Any further comments before we... Right, okay, I think that's it. It's been moved, seconded with those additional two informatives. All those in favour, please indicate. That's everyone. Obviously no votes against or abstentions. We now move on to our final application this evening, which is number 13, page 11, 85 Moraine Drive, Downswood. We were expecting Councillor Newton, but we did receive a message some time before the meeting that he was stuck in Tunbridge Wells and was not expected to arrive in time. So, and he hasn't. So, I would say that he did not ask to speak on this application, but it was on the previous one. The parish council are here to speak to this one, I think. Right, without further ado, the officer, please introduce.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be brief. The application is for a two-storey side and rear extension to a domestic house. Downswood Parish Council have objected to the proposal on the basis the extension is, in their view, considered too large and the remaining garden space too small. It is your officer's view that the proposal is considered to be of an appropriate scale and meets policy H18 and the supplementary planning document residential extensions. The proposal would not damage residential amenity and there have been no objections from neighbouring properties. 2 off-street car parking spaces would be retained and this is considered to be adequate. While there is not a minimum garden size policy, a usable garden area of 8 to 10 square metres would remain. The recommendation is to approve subject to conditions.
Thank you very much. Well, we move to Councillor Greenhead, Downswood Parish Council. Thank you for your patience.
Good evening, Chairman, members. We at Downswood Parish Council need to make sure that plans to extend properties don't have a negative impact on the happiness and safety of our parishioners. We feel this development will have a detrimental effect on the neighbours and implications for the entire estate. Rain Drive is a series of roads that snake, tree-like, to several dead ends. 85 Moraine Drive is part of a shared circular drive feeding from a cul-de-sac off the road, which is one of the smallest dead ends you are likely to see. This makes it especially sensitive to development. That's not to say there isn't room for an extension. There is room for a more modest build, but Downswood Planning Committee feel that this particular addition is a little over-ambitious compared to the size of the original house. An extra room is added to make a 4-bedroom house, which means you could possibly have 5 car owners. There is only realistically room for 2 outside the house. We have major problems with access to our roads because of car numbers, not helped by a maze-like design for Downswood. If this is allowed in its current design, it will set a precedent with other extensions overdeveloping Downswood, choking our roads. Emergency vehicles have problems now getting to certain areas in the village as it is. We are happy to see people improving their homes, but we must take into account the overall safety and happiness of Downswood residents as a whole. We think the plans need a bit of tweaking, so we need to ask the members to reject the application on the grounds that parking is insufficient in the cramped cul-de-sac. Thank you, Chairman and members.
Right, to take any declarations of lobbying? No one being lobbied? Don't think we have any urgent updates, just check. No urgent updates. No ward members either, so Councillor Borton, you raced into the front with your indication to speak.
Oh, you can hear me. That's helpful. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I know this quite well. I've lived on Down for most of my life. And the parish council are right. It is a bit of a maze if you don't know where you're going, and all the roads do look the same if you've never been there before. I mean, the problem with this application really is that there are some hideous extensions in Downswood. I think it's fair to state across the estate, and there are a lot of parking problems as well. But the fact I note quite strongly that there's been no objections raised by any of the neighbours in the immediate vicinity of this, and so for that reason, being at the end of a very long cul-de-sac, I'm sure that we would have received some were there any major problems. So while I sympathise with some of the broader concerns that the parish council have about the issues in Downswood, I don't think they're material to this application that we have here. So therefore, I will be very happy to move the officer's recommendations as on the papers in front of us.
Councillor Bolton, is that seconded at this point? Councillor Stockwell, do you wish to speak now? Right, Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, in principle, this complies in every way, and you know, just because an extension's going on, we cannot read from that there will be any impact on the wider highway, and there is no objection anyway from that perspective. There's just one small thing, in that this is a fairly significant extension for the size of the house. And within our residential extensions SPD, we do specifically refer to the MPPF bit about building the niches in for wildlife. We're losing the garden, so therefore no, we're not going to have the garden for any wildlife. So therefore I think the least they can do is put a swift brick in the eaves, and it's in the SPD. And actually, the inspector picked it out as praiseworthy when he oversaw our SPD. So with that small change, which I'd like the mover and seconder to perhaps take on board, I'm happy to support.
Can I just check? No disagreement there, so we'll include that. Councillor Cox.
Could I just ask officers, if the applicant hadn't applied, would this have been permitted under permitted development?
No, my understanding is as a two-storey extension, this would not have been permitted development.
Thank you. Right, I see no further speakers, therefore I will put that recommendation as slightly as amended with the swift brick to members. All those in favour? Those against? Well, there won't be any because it was unanimous. Thank you, members, for your time and input. There are no announcements and no appeals, so that is the end of the meeting.